Hi, Mississippi Quilters. Terry Hartman here with our July rendition of America's 250 Year Sew Along. We got a lot to cover today, not only our blocks, but a few other things that are happening in the MQA world. So I just want to let you know we got 4 blocks this month. 3 of them are fairly easy. One of them was quite difficult, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the 4 blocks are Lewis and Clark, Prairie House block, this is the Railroad block, and this is our Chinese Lantern block. So to get started, I wanted to do the Lewis and Clark block, and I will say this right now. I chose the block because of the history. The block itself was extremely difficult. So when I give you the instructions, you guys have got to pay attention to the instructions and how it's assembled because it is not intuitive. So let's talk about the history of Lewis and Clark. So Lewis and Clark's expedition was also called the Corps of Discovery Expedition, and it was made up of the U.S. Army and some civilian personnel. There were only about 30 people in the original expedition, and it did not actually grow hardly at all in the entire time that they were going across Western America. Thomas Jefferson was the one that commissioned them to do the expedition after he convinced Congress that it was something that we needed to do. And he did that right after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And the reason that he was looking for, wanted to do it was that he was looking for another way to cross to the western portion of America without having to go through the desert, because going through the desert was extremely brutal and it was difficult and they did not have great success. So he was looking for a northern route. He wanted to increase his commerce to the western side of this country, but more importantly, he wanted to basically solidify the U.S. sovereignty in North America. So that was the major reason behind the scenes that he really wanted to happen. And what's really crazy is the total expenditure that was voted for on this particular trip was $2,324. Now, this expedition lasted well over a year. So for well over a year, they had $2,300 with which to do what they needed to do, which was incredible if you think about it. So Thomas Jefferson specifically chose Lewis. And the reason was he had worked with Lewis before, and I want to read you something because it definitely shows you what Thomas Jefferson was thinking about when he was selecting Lewis. And this is what he said: "It was impossible to find a character who to a complete science in botany, natural history, mineralogy, and astronomy joined the firmness of constitution and character, prudence, habits adapted to the woods, and a familiarity with the Indian manners and character requisite for this undertaking. All the latter qualification Captain Lewis has." So he was very specific in what he was looking for, and he really understood what it meant to have this expedition succeed. So to that end, not only did he select him, but he ensured that he had all the tools available. So one of the things that he did for Lewis prior to them actually going on the expedition was he sent Lewis to learn from the top people in all of these fields. So he went to somebody in medicine, astronomy, botany, and fossils. So he really developed an extensive knowledge. Now, albeit Lewis himself was an extremely intelligent individual, so it wasn't a difficult jump for him to become the resident expert across the board. And I think that's why Thomas Jefferson chose him. Now, Lewis was a captain, and he picked one of his lieutenants, which was Clark. So Clark was the other individual that went on this expedition, and they had worked together extensively, so they knew how to work together. So with that being said, Captain Lewis developed the keel boat, so he had exacting specifications on how he wanted the boats built that were going to traverse the rivers all the way to the west coast. And they were built in Pittsburgh, and then they were floated down the Ohio River, and they ended up going all the way over to Camp Du Bois, Illinois in 1804. So one of the things I thought was interesting about this was he was adamant that they have a dog on board their boat. And so he chose a Newfoundland because apparently, number one, they're very easy to get along with as far as people are concerned, but more importantly, they can be quite critical if they needed to do a water rescue. So this Newfoundland, his name was Seaman. That's what they called him. He was one of the group, and he went all the way across with them, which I thought was kind of neat. You know that, and as you heard last month, Sacagawea was very instrumental during a boat capsizing when she ensured that they got all of their papers and their maps and all the stuff, their notes, and the Newfoundland was part of that rescue. So I thought it was pretty neat that he actually had the forethought to think about things that could happen along the way. So one of the things that the expedition did was they developed working relations with 24 different native tribes all the way across the northern portion of America. And those 24 tribes, if they had not done that, the expedition would have starved to death. So it is imperative that we understand how important the Native Americans were to the success of this particular expedition. The Lakota Indians, which if you've ever been out to North Dakota, there's a beautiful statue of a Lakota woman wrapped in a quilt. So the Lakota Indians were part of the group in North Dakota. Now, later they named them the Sioux, and so the Sioux Indians were extremely aggressive. They were very aggressive, and so they had a very difficult time trying to interact with them and develop any kind of a working relationship with them. And so they were negotiating with them, and they ultimately were successful because the Sioux Indians wanted to do a trade environment. And the thing that solved the breach between the two was the Americans' ability to guarantee trade for, you're not going to believe this, tobacco. That's what the Indians wanted. They wanted tobacco, and so that's what they bartered. That's what they decided that the Indians would receive, and so that's how they ended up working with the Sioux Indians, which I thought was, again, one of those things. It's like tobacco is the thing. So, and then later on they met the fur trader. Remember last month I told you about Toussaint Charbonneau and Sacagawea? So that was later on that they met those two, and you learned about them last month. And again, I told you they were extremely instrumental in the success of this expedition because of the fact that Sacagawea could speak so many native languages. So they reached the Pacific. So they started out in 1804, and they reached the Pacific on 7 November 1805. So November in the Northwest is still tough, okay? So they stayed there in the Northwest. They developed relations all along that particular area of the coast. And then they started their return trip on March 23rd, 1806. Now, they're going along and they get just past the Great Divide, the Continental Divide, and then they split up. And that was the July 3rd, 1806. And they went separate ways, and one took the north and one took the south. And then they reunited in August of 1806, and they finished in St. Louis in September of 1806. So all total, it took them almost 2 years to get out there and all the way back. Now, the entire time that they're out there, they're sending provisions and things that they found back. And so they're showing that it is still extremely lucrative for this expedition to continue to go on. And they also wanted to let them know that they were actually still alive. So the expedition was extremely instrumental in the westward expansion of America. And upon their return to St. Louis, the fervor to move west was just ignited. And so we had a lot more people who were willing to go out west. And so I chose the second block, the house block. And again, this is not your typical house block. This is a prairie house block. And but I want to talk about just the house block for now. The house block was actually originated in late 19th century. And it was actually called the Old Homestead Block. And it was a famous rendition of the Red Schoolhouse Block. And the first documented block was bright red and indigo blue, and it was named Old Kentucky Home, and that was around 1870 to 1890. Now, I've talked about Ruth Finley before in the history of quilt making. She made a book in 1929, and it was called The Old Patchwork and Women Who Made Them book. And she put this block in, well, not this block, but the house block. She put that block in, and she was not really happy with it because she felt like it represented the decline of the craft because it was a pretty simple block. But she made her thoughts known, and the American quilters spoke differently, and so they reignited the attention to the American house block, and it got to be very, very popular. I specifically chose this Prairie House block because I wanted to represent our pioneer movement across America as we blazed trails. Remember, our block blazed trails throughout the plains in Western America. So that was why I chose this block. Now the third block is the railroad block. Now the railroad, I know you all know how important the railroad was, but I wanted to make sure that we caught this part of our history. I'm not going to talk about the block per se, but I'm going to talk about the railroad and the way that we developed our railroad across America. The first transatlantic or transcontinental railroad is called the Pacific Railroad, and it was later called the Overland Route. And it is 1,911 miles, and they built it between 1863 and 1869. And it connected existing rail from Council Bluff, Iowa to the Oakland Long Wharf in San Francisco Bay. And what I thought was interesting was it was actually 3 private companies that built the railroad. It was the Western Pacific, who built 132 miles of the railroad. The Central Pacific Railroad of California built 690 miles, and then the Union Pacific Railroad built 8,085 miles. So all total, it ended up being 1,911 miles. Now, what's interesting is the railroad was built on public land, and it used U.S. land grants to actually pay for the construction, which I thought was insane. So you have a private company building a railroad on public lands using public money. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So they opened it for traffic on May 10th of 1869 when the California Pacific Railroad president, Leland Stanford, which I'm sure you're probably putting 2 and 2 together. Stanford means maybe Stanford University down the road. So Leland Stanford was the president, and he drove the gold spike at Promontory Summit in September 6, 1869. And the first passenger arrived in San Francisco in 1869. And it opened commerce significantly for Western America, and it was instrumental in lowering the cost of getting farmers' crops to urban centers. So you see the immediate benefit of having a railroad across America, because now the farmers, instead of it taking weeks to get their stuff by wagon to an urban center for processing, it just takes days, and it saved tremendous amounts of money. Now, as I'm finishing up the research on the railroad, I come across this mind-blowing fact, which I thought was incredible. And so, had the railroad not finished after the Louisiana Purchase, it would have taken 300 years to establish what the railroad did in just 30. So, Louisiana Purchase, 300 years by wagon. With the railroad, it took 30 years. And again, it's a true testament to how invention and grit molded our country. So I thought that was very, very, very interesting. Now, the last block is our Chinese block. So this block, Katie McRaven kind of designed it, and I kind of tweaked it for quilters because I wanted to make it a little bit easier, because some of these angles can be quite tough. This one right here is a little tough. So Katie and I came up with this block. I'm really happy with it as well. So I chose this block because I wanted I wanted to show you all the sacrifices the Chinese actually made when it came to building that railroad. And I really couldn't find a block, and so we kind of came up with something, and I thought this was fairly representative of the Chinese population. So the Chinese arrived on the West Coast in the after the gold rush started in the gold rush of California started in 1845 to 1855. Now, you know, everybody goes, they all wanted to go to California for the gold rush because they all thought they were going to make their money. But we all understood what a myth it was for 99% of the population. People just did not find gold. So then you end up with this massive amount of population that doesn't have anything. And so so the Chinese were out there in California, and when the idea of started to build this railroad came to be, they started to try and gather the laborers, and they were finding out they were having a great difficulty finding laborers. Again, it was right after the Civil War, so there were a lot of men that just weren't there anymore in the aftermath of that. And not only that, but what was it? They had the Chinese population out in California, but what was interesting was they thought that they were too weak to actually do the labor. And a manservant of one of the owners said, you know, you really should think about the Chinese. They might be able to do the work for you. And so that's how it started. And they actually started with a crew of just 21 people, 21 Chinese laborers. And then within a month, it grew to 50. And then by the end of the completion of the railroad, they averaged between 15 to 20,000 Chinese workers. Now, that was 90% of the workers that were building the railroad. The other 10% were Irish. Again, I've talked about the Irish before and how they've done. So it was pretty interesting to see that two immigrant populations are the one that pretty much built most of America. Now, the Chinese worked for $26 a month. $26. And they worked 6 days a week. And the Chinese had to pay for their food that they got from the railroad. The white workers did not. And so there was a great disparity because, number one, the Chinese were paid anywhere between 30 to 50% less than the white workers were, and they end up buying their own food, which they were very upset about. So about 300 of them decided that they were going to go on strike. They struck for 8 days, and in 8 days, the owners of the railroad decided that they had enough, and they cut off their food. And so they were going to starve them to death. So the strike ended because they were starving, but more importantly, they did not get a raise in wage, no. But their living conditions and food requirements and all that were increased. So they did end up getting a better turn after the strike. And the reason was because this owner simply understood that if they didn't have the Chinese workers, the railroad wasn't going to be finished. So they said, okay, got to cut our losses and pony up something, and so they did. So that's exactly what they did. Now, what I really wanted to kind of talk about is that history has completely downplays the impact that the Chinese workers had on the building of the railroad. And our westward expansion relied on the fact that that railroad connected. So again, it connected, and when you look at all the different things that we've had in our country, but you look at the immigrant populations that have really come together and made sure that we were successful, and that is what America is known for. So I just kind of wanted to, you know, kind of put that out there. What an interesting fact, though, is the Chinese built this railroad, and they were denied citizenship until 1943. So Congress finally passed an act in 1943 that allowed the Chinese population to actually become American citizens. Now, that's all I have as far as our history of our blocks, but let's talk about the construction. Okay, so Lewis and Clark, it looks easy. Okay, it's not. Okay, so when I'm in the process of writing the instructions, and I will tell you, so this is a central line here, and of course, when I did it, I think 3 times, I did, four square, you know, square and square, easy peasy, and then I get to trying to figure out how to put all the rest of it together, and it wasn't working. So then I literally sat down with a piece of paper with the outline of the block and probably tried every imaginable combination you could imagine. So anyway, so I come up with this, which is just this part right here. You assemble that, yay. And then you assemble this to the blue, and then this, and then you have to do this, and then that red. So it's not, so it's kind of like back and forth, but that's the only way I could get it to work. Now, I will tell you, I did try 4 at a time flying geese, could not figure out how to get this calculation right. So again, we're doing it the traditional way, okay? So that block, very much pay attention to the instructions, okay? This block, super easy. What I will say about this block is when you're putting the windows in, pay particular attention to where these are, because I did it once and the window was over here. And in the way the block was designed, it was supposed to be up and down. So just so you know, that one is just a little bit. This one I did, and I will tell you that I flipped these blocks. I think Morgan found it last month because I had them up here before we were doing the video, and she said, that's wrong. So anyway, so I redid this one, and so this is my railroad block. And this one, it's really easy. It looks hard, but these are all half square triangles right here. This is a half square triangle. This is a half rectangle. And it was fairly easy to do for the larger one, but I'm working on the smaller one, and my ruler just doesn't go down that far. So I'm kind of working on guessing on how big that actually has to be. So I'll post a picture when I get that one done. So anyway, so that's that. Now I wanted to talk a little bit before we close about the summer gathering is coming, and that is in August. And I've looked at registration numbers recently, and we've got about 70 to 80. Now I will say this, our website right now, they're having some kind of a difficulty, not our website per se, but the serving company that actually monitors all of it. There's something going on, and they're doing their best. And all I can say is keep trying if you're registering. And if you do run into any kind of weird problems, just email us and let us know, or give me a call. You guys got my number, and let us know so we can try and get that fixed up for you. Now I got one more treat for you, and I want to talk about something else, and we're going to pull the panel out, so I want to show you what we're going to get ready to do here pretty soon. This is the panel that we're going to use for in September. So I want to say this, Katie and I have been talking, because she's the one that designed the blocks around it, and she went out and looked, and they're kind of getting scarce. So if it's something that you want to participate in, you might want to go ahead and get your panel. So now what I want to talk about is we're going to come up with, we have 2 designs for you. One is just a really, it's absolutely gorgeous design around this panel, but it's super easy. Okay, so if you wanted to participate in the sew along, but you wanted something easier, then that will be the thing that you're going to see. Okay, and then the second one, we are working on, we're taking all these little blocks and we're putting it around the outside edge. So, and it's turning out beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. But I wanted you guys to see this so that you can kind of get an idea of what we're going to do in September. My hopes is that in at the summer gathering that we're going to show you what they're going to look like. So got my fingers crossed that I can get that done for you, because you know, some of these blocks are tough, and I will tell you this right now, I have gone through all of the blocks for the rest of the year, and I have looked at them long and hard and go, is this something that's doable as a 6-inch and a 12-inch? And I've kind of decided no, and then I'll change it to something a little bit easier. So most of the blocks are going to be fairly easy as we come through, because we've only got about 20 blocks left, and by the time we get done, we're going to have about 50. So I originally started with 48, and I decided we have 50 states, let's do 50 blocks. Again, you choose what you want to do. And make it as easy as you want or as hard as you want. I do have a few more blocks that are kind of tough, but again, they tell the story in a way, so I decided that yes, we're just going to put them in, and I'll just pull my hair out as we go along. So with that being said, this is our block, this is our panel for the quilt if you guys want to go ahead and do it. Again, it's Moda Primitive Gatherings, and you can go out there. There are a few places you can still find it. I went out there a few days ago, and they're still out there, but if you're wanting it, you better go out and find it. So with that being said, August is coming. August is kind of a special month for y'all because I decided that we were going to do just a Mississippi month. So August is Mississippi month. So you'll get to see 4 blocks that I consider to be kind of Mississippi oriented. So keep sewing. If you've got questions, you run into stuff, let me know. Oh, just so you know, this little particular thing here, this is the half rectangle block. I actually found a tutorial for it, and I'm going to put it on the Pinterest webpage for y'all so you can kind of see there's a couple 3 ways that you can do it. And I did put it out there so that you could see it to make it a little bit easier. So, but again, post your progress. Let me see what you're doing. My wall is getting full, as you can see. I can't wait to start putting it together. And keep sewing, ladies, and I will see you next month. Have a great day. Bye-bye.